Welcome back. Thank you for joining me on the MMA RAXPOD, the return of the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 296. Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington in Las Vegas, Nevada. It is the last event of the year, and I understand I've been AWOL from a podcast perspective, but I did say at the last one that I did, I'm not sure for what show it was, that I'm probably only going to be doing these for pay-per-views going forward, or at least for the time being. So I'm happy to be back and grateful that you would all join me again after this hiatus. And I'll get into 12 picks that I have this week, including both of the main events. I'll do quick reflection on the event last week. Not necessarily all the time that I've missed from a listening perspective since the last RAXPOD, but I should at least talk about the fights that happened last week. I don't want to call it devastating because what happened the previous week was far worse with the pair of slam KOs. I spoke about it on Twitter, but it's truly alarming. You know, the 13th and 14th slam KOs in MMA history happening back to back, and that you'd get burned on that is a true anomaly in the long term of things, but even that something stings more than narrowly missing out on a highly profitable night due to a split decision, which is what happened with Jun Young Park. So it is what it is. I didn't have Park graded out to playing beyond minus 200, but I did think that he was graded priced pretty appropriately, rather. He was, I believe I played him around 185, 190, and going in, it just seemed like he was going to be the more productive striker on the feet, and Muniz, for the parts of the fight that did take place on the feet, he did a good job of using his range to not give Park a clear way to get off any combos or even get anything off beyond pairs of strikes in a way where the reset would open a window for a potential takedown, which up until through the first two rounds Muniz was able to do pretty successfully. What I thought was the turning point of the first round was the second round, and really the turning point of the fight was the scramble that they had where it looked like Park was going to come out on top, and unfortunately just the momentum carried Muniz a little bit further and he was able to roll over on top, and Park kind of committed to not conceding that round and giving it more of a go in the third round, which was a good strategy because Muniz did end up getting tired after not successfully shooting takedowns in the third round. But you would have liked to see Park, his takedown defense hold up earlier in the fight relative to, I believe it was something up towards 69%, which is round average, if not slightly above that for, average UFC fighter standards. Muniz obviously grappling edge, but Park, you saw how once he was able to get top control, I believe he does have the UFC record for ground strike rate. He's excellent in that. And you saw how he was able to make enough of an impression to win the first and third rounds of the fight in the eyes of two different judges. But because of the way the scoring panned out, where one judge all the judges gave the second round of Muniz, obviously, but two of the judges just saw it differently. For the first and the third, Muniz ends up winning the fight despite not winning all of the rounds according to the way the points come in. It's a similar thing that happened with Dustin Jacoby against Khalil Roundtree last year, which was another fight that I had the fighter that actually won the rounds but lost on the points due to the way the split was scored. So I have literally been there before, and it was easier to process. And as for the other favorite that I missed, the Tyra Hernandez fight, I am honestly treating that as an anomaly, although I did start this year taking a Hernandez over when he fought Nascimento, and that was when he had really never been finished in his career, period, I believe, and obviously went down in the first round. He survived the first round against Tyra, which I thought actually made the bet look, like a good. It looked like a good bet going into the second round. Tyra was young enough where these fighters start to come into their power at a certain point, and I believe he's 24 now, so he's still extremely young, but obviously much more seasoned than where he was at a year ago when he was fighting I believe CJ Vergara, for example, and still getting submissions on him, but at that point he was still really showing off his submission skills and was not necessarily as eager to strike with anybody. Even the Kairez fight, we saw he wasn't necessarily super eager to put that fight into a striking position as much as get to the ground and try to get to mount, which Kairez had shown he was very willing to concede. So Tyra knocking out a guy that had never been knocked out like that, I mean, that is a big win for Tyra, and it says a lot about him. I was a little bit apprehensive about, I guess, making the over a leg. I was debating between that and Jusei just because I wasn't sure what was going to end up being the more certain commodity. But at the end of the day, what put it over for me was knowing that Hernandez having taken an over on Hernandez in the past, showed me that, or just made me feel less confident. And I wanted to take that anyway, just because, obviously taking Tyra at 600 is not really responsible, even though I had an extremely strong grade on him. So I treat it as an anomaly how it ended, because the first round, I mean, Hernandez showed that he was at least capable of defending the bad position that he had gotten himself in if Tyra wanted to keep chasing submissions. And then he suffered the first knockout loss of his career to a guy that had not really shown that level of striking in the UFC before. So kind of an anomaly, but it does show going forward that if you've bet a 2.5 over before and the fighter has gotten finished in the first round, you really need to exercise caution about not only betting an over on a fight that involves that fighter as a significant underdog again going forward, but also if you're going to take that, how much do you really want to have faith in it in terms of putting it in a parlay? You should just be putting it in a moonshot, which is what I did last week, just because, I said trying to get a ridiculous return for all the work that I put into these picks. So speaking of which, got plenty of those for UFC 296. So I think that's enough of wallowing in the shame of what was an otherwise, pretty decent amount of work for that card. I was happy to at least get one underdog last week with the Roundtree Smith call. one day that Tim Elliott fade is coming. I'm telling you, he's whooping my ass more than most fighters this year. But I hope that the veteran UFC fans are enjoying the Tim Elliott renaissance. I'm sure Muhammad Makayev finds it amusing. Anyway, let's get on to UFC 296 and the first fight of the evening, which features Randy Brown and Muslim Salikov. So these are two fighters that I've had accurate reads on relative to this year. Randy Brown, you'll recall, was part of one of the parlays that I hit, or was a main leg of the parlays that I hit at my first clean sweep this year, which was Fight Night Emmett Topuria. He fought Wellington Turman that night, and I was pretty confident based on Brown's superior experience going the distance and experience in the final round, or success in the final round rather, combined with his relatively comparable submission skills relative to Turman's ability and the tools that he had at his disposal, with Turman also moving down in weight, that he was going to be in a good position there. I was surprised to see so many people advocating that Turman won that fight, even though it was a unanimous decision in favor of Brown. In spite of the fact that Brown had the experience advantage, it was surprising to see him concede the home stretch, even though he had won the first two rounds pretty convincingly to a fighter that he would have had the perceived advantages or equalizers against in a lot of different areas. But he clinched more than I think a lot of people expected, and he didn't make the most of the tools he had relative to the reach advantage, and just was not really able to get the striking going as dominantly as I think people expected, even though he won the first round pretty convincingly, I believe. He just faded down the stretch, I think, harder than some people were maybe anticipating. And he was a 2-1 favorite in that fight, and I still felt good about him going into that. But as I watched that performance, the confidence waned a little bit. And it didn't expire or anything, but he just didn't perform the level that I think he should have relative to the ability that Turman has in that weight class. And I think that was reflected by Turman's follow-up performance, which we just saw Jared Gooden knock him out only about 2 weekends ago. So, and guess who called that one too? Just not on the podcast. Anyway, Salikov, conversely, I did not feel super confident about against Nicholas Dalby. In fact, I believe I actually had Dalby graded to win, but I just didn't feel I after picking Fiallo to beat Salikov and thinking that there would finally be a fall off at 38, it just didn't happen. And I don't necessarily think it happened against Dalby either. I think Dalby's just kind of, his own beast, which we saw in his follow-up fight, upsetting the Bonfim brother at like plus 500 odds or something. So Salikov's drop-off hasn't come yet, despite him entering at 39 years old. And he is a guy that still has, hurt you power. Power that has been observed in the UFC, and he's, as many people have anointed previously, the greatest wushu kickboxer of all time. He's going to have the striking advantage here, in spite of the age, in spite of the reach he's giving up, in spite of the fact that Brown is 4 inches taller than him as well. Brown has just not shown the he has the tools, I think, to intimidate some of the lesser opponents that may be Salikov's size, that don't have the striking acumen and accolades that an opponent like that has. I think about the fight against Cowboy Oliveira that Brown had, where even though it says Brown won by submission, I mean, he was very, very badly piecing Oliveira up in that fight in a way that it would just look totally outclassed. And it was largely because Brown just looked like he could be fighting 2 weight classes above where he actually was in comparison to a welterweight that was the size of Cowboy Oliveira. So I expect Salikov to be able to hurt Brown here. And Brown is a guy that has been knocked out multiple times in the UFC and also got finished in the first round this year against Jack Della Maddalena in a fight where he got knocked down in that one too, and then club and subbed rather than actually knocked out outright. But he doesn't have he even though I wouldn't say he has outright, like I would say that a second round KO is probably more likely than a first round KO just based on the way that Brown faded in his last fight. So if Salikov is able to, keep things standing, which I anticipate he will, but it's going to be more about how is he able to get out of the clinch and then circle back into the away from the fence to get the fight back into strictly striking terms. That's really what's going to be the key for him getting a victory. I think I've heard some opinions this week say that they're interested in what his offensive wrestling is going to look like, and they'd like to see him mix it up like that. But I think Salikov's key to victory is to just make this a 15-minute kickboxing match. Because Brown has shown that in spite of the tools that you would think that he has in this weight class, he just doesn't have the ability to deploy them consistently. But he has, done other. He has been better about winning fights in other ways, just not by actually, hurting fighters consistently with power. Like, he went to decision with Jared Gooden. I was at 274 when he fought Chaos Williams, and I was disappointed with the outcome of that fight because Chaos Williams was one of the only underdogs I had that night other than DeLima, and none of my underdogs hit that night, so I was pretty disappointed. I didn't think Brown won, but it was a very close decision. And then Trinaldo's a guy who's never been knocked out, but I mean, the age gap there was also pretty considerable. But even that, I think, was a fight in which Trinaldo came on later in the fight, and Brown once again faded down the stretch. So I think the danger here is if Brown isn't able to finish Salikov, which is more than likely that this probably is going to go the distance, I think. If Brown starts fading after the first round, you think that Salikov is probably going to be able to win the third round when Brown is too tired to keep him on the fence at that point. So it's ultimately going to come down to what is going to happen in the second round, who's going to be able to more effectively deploy their game plan. So I see this ending in a 29-28. I just don't know who it's going to go to. And I've got Brown graded to win. A lot of it has to do with, the tools that he has that over a long-term evaluation of MMA, those fighters are going to win when they've got those advantages, particularly strung together: age gap, reach, height, and offensive volume. Those are all very, very good things to have in your favor. But we know the power Salikov has coming back. We've seen Brown get hurt by high-level strikers in the UFC, like Vincente Luque. And even though Brown has good finishes in his own right, one of the only fighters to finish Brian Barberena, lately we've seen too much fading down the stretch against fighters that have comparable ability to perform late into fights to make you feel good about betting Brown at a 2-1 or 3-1 price tag, especially coming off his last performance. Now, when I was typing up the stay away earlier this week, Brown was at 300, and then sometime over Monday night or possibly early Tuesday morning, some huge play must have come in on Salikov because his price dropped like 50 points overnight. So there's obviously at least some sort of confidence that, from the market that Salikov is going to be able to put the fight on his terms at some point. And I tend to agree with that thinking. The question is going to be how quickly does it happen? Does it happen in the second or does it happen in the third? But the longer Brown goes without finishing this, the more confident I think you have to be in Salikov. So, if you're a live bettor, this is, I think, a very interesting fight to take a look at depending on how the second round plays out. If you're pretty confident that Brown ends up banking the first 2 rounds and then Salikov kind of lights him up in the third but doesn't really drop him or anything, and you see you've got Brown at pick-em odds at that point, I think you could probably feel good about getting him at 29-28. It's going to be hard for a split decision to go to a Russian on American soil right now. You know what I mean? Just ask Tagir Ulanbekov about that, and we're going to talk about him soon. But I'm staying away from this one. I slightly edge Brown to win. I think, if he was closer down to 175 or something, I'd probably be more interested. But there's so many other better spots with juice on them on this spot or on this card, particularly, when you're talking about fighters that are available at 2-1. So I would just watch this first fight as a fan. Don't get too invested in this. Don't let the first fight on this really high-level card sour your betting evening. Just appreciate it as a fan and hope for a finish, because it would be nice to see one of these guys take the other one out rather than have it go to the judges, and then we're probably going to be looking at it as some sort of murky decision one way or the other. But like to see some action. Not sure if we're going to get it because Brown likes to clinch, but we'll see how it goes and just enjoy it as a fan. The next fight is Martin Buday and Shamil Gaziev. So I had quite a roller coaster of a contender series this year. I started out very hot and then finished very flat. But I believe the tail end of my hot streak was taking the under in the Shamil Gaziev Greg Velasco main event of Dana White's Contender Series Season 7, Week 7. That fight was quite a roller coaster because Gaziev, unfortunately that fight doesn't really tell us that much, because Velasco, first of all, was like a plus 1,000 underdog. There was no value on the money lines of that fight, and people were wondering, is this fight really lined appropriately? And it was immediately upon the first punch thought, Gaziev comes out, he's smiling at this dude, and then just immediately floors Velasco with one punch, and it's bad. So you would think at that point he's going to finish him pretty easily, but then, and I can't believe, I haven't heard anybody make this point yet this week, but Gaziev not only didn't finish Velasco after dropping him like that, he inexplicably allowed his back to get taken after knocking down his opponent. I don't think I've ever seen that. It's one thing if the fighter got back to their feet and then was able to take the back while standing, and then in some sort of weird trip or scramble ended up getting the back take. But Velasco was floored onto his back, first punch, and Shamil, while collapsing into him to try to get the finish, inexplicably allowed Velasco to take his back. The problem was, as Lorosenko identified, Velasco was so short for the division. He's I guess 6'2". He's 6'2", 263, but his legs were too short to actually get around Gaziev's waist to lock in a body triangle. And so Gaziev was eventually able to turn around very easily and, proceed through top control to find a submission. But he was fighting a guy that was, laughably lined below him in terms of ability. And that's been the case for most of the fighters that he's competed against, with the exception of this one guy, Karol Rosa, who would be undefeated if not for fighting Gaziev in Aries FC 7 over in Russia in what was a split decision. Now, I don't know if Aries is on Fight Pass. Perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't. I try to do a little bit of dumpster diving. I would do it last year for some of the regional footage to try to get a sense, but there's so many of the guys on this list that Gaziev has fought are cans that really that only fight that's worth investigating is against Karol Rosa. And tragically, the video that hosts that fight has been made private on YouTube, so you can't really watch it, but there are a minute of highlights available on a Facebook video. And I think one thing that you do see is that Gaziev is a guy that's really going to rely on offensive wrestling. And, if the only striking we've seen from him really is one-shot power. We haven't seen the consistent deployment of volume from him, especially because a lot of his fights, the overwhelming majority don't even get out of the first round. He's only had 3 of his 11 fights go past the first 5 minutes. The first 5 fights of his career didn't even make it out of the first minute. So a lot of can crushing, and you just wonder if that measures up against someone like Buday, who has done a similar amount of can crushing in the UFC, albeit can crushing in the UFC is much different than can crushing in Belarusian Fighting Championship or MMA Series Fighting Championship Pankration. Should have just stuck with Belarusian Fighting Championship. That drives the series home enough. He was also on another contender series for Belarusian Fighting Championship, BFC, so not quite DWCS. But the point is, Gaziev ain't fought nobody other than Kornilov. That fight went to a split decision. It was over-reliance on offensive wrestling in positions that he really didn't even end up securing. And he was kind of just sloppily shooting in for takedowns the later the fight went on. What we have seen from Buday, conversely, someone who I made a leg in his appearances against both Jake Collier and Josh Parisian, are, even though he is a heavyweight that fights to decision in most cases, which isn't optimal, this is a guy that has a surprisingly well-rounded skill set for the heavyweight division. And he has a little bit of the Volkanovski effect of being a guy that used to walk around at a significantly heavier weight than he operates at now. And for that, his athleticism sort of gets a boost, even though he doesn't have the Volkanovski physique now, or even a rugby player's physique to begin with, but he is a heavyweight that cuts to make 265, and for it, the people that actually have seen him in the octagon in person will tell you he's surprisingly one of the largest fighters in the UFC, deceptively. I actually didn't even realize until I was taping him this week and the UFC commentary team brought it up in his fight with Parisian that Buday used to be 360 pounds at 6'4". And so he is a guy that is cutting to make 265. And yet he is someone that has only lost by decision in his entire MMA career in what was his second MMA appearance against Juan Espino. But he has not lost a decision in the UFC. his fight with Lucas Brzeski was kind of a red flag, and I think a lot of people that don't like him are fading him based off of that appearance. But you really have to look at his appearance, like what he did against Kelleher and Parisian, and give him credit. I was talking about how I thought the difference in his fight with Kelleher was going to be the head protection that he clearly evidently had in better spades than what Kelleher did. And I thought that combined with the lesser attrition was going to pay dividends for him if he was able to delay the fight out as he had shown a preference for doing. And that's exactly what happened. He endured an early onslaught from Kelleher in the first round. Kelleher ended up gassing himself, and Buday, even though he wasn't throwing as much volume in the third round, endured enough of the first round to put forth so much volume in the second round without really taking anything back from Kelleher that by the time they went to the third round, it was evident who had been more hurt, and Buday was able to just kind of ride it out from there for a unanimous decision. Against Parisian, though, Buday had an even better performance than I think I could have anticipated. Parisian had concerns coming in relative to what he had shown in some of his other recent events, but Buday rather, really showed you the full suite of ability that you like. And they pointed out, I think the broadcast team did, or I might have heard this on another podcast that I listened to this week, but getting a Kimura at the UFC level at heavyweight is just not an easy. You have to be extremely strong to be able to pull that off. And so, while I'm pumping the brakes on, how talented Buday's submission ability is overall, it is his second win by Kimura in his MMA career. All his other wins have been knockouts, but the fact that he has been able to pull that off against a UFC level opponent shows, he's 32 years old. That's right, towards the end of prime stage, I think, for a lot of these athletes, but he's still showing additions to his skill set, even as he's entering those years of his UFC and his MMA career. So you just don't have a lot, conversely, for Gaziev, other than, he was a training buddy with, who was it, Magomed Ankalaev and somebody else. There was someone else on Contender Series this year that was like a former sparring partner of Islam Makhachev or Umar Nurmagomedov or something, and he was lined as like a 300 favorite and ended up getting upset, and he was actually finished even in late down the stretch in the third round. So, that's just, you can't really build. Listen, I played Kevin Jousset last week on the basis that he was training at a world-class gym, and that's entirely different than being someone that's just like a sparring partner with, fighters that have made it to elite levels. It's the training that these guys go through when you're brought up through a gym that's like overlooking your entire process with fighters that have consistently made it to the elite level, as opposed to just, getting in there and doing, like, effectively going through the motions. Albeit you're doing rehearsals with extremely high level talent, but you're not actually fighting the elite talent like that in your real appearances. And so while you're able to beat the Vladislav Kozlovsky and Alexei Drzuhins and Murad Adurbayevs and Grigory Ponomareyevs and the Denis Gavazdevs of the world. Artur Bunkov. I'm just reading. These are all the fighters that Shamil Gaziev has fought, okay? So, he also beat Darko Stosic, who I believe washed out of the UFC. So there you go. In terms of ain't fought nobody, he has at least competed with somebody. But Stosic, went 1-3, lost 3 decisions and wasn't even a natural heavyweight. Well, I mean, it's weird saying it like that because if they're light heavyweights, they could make heavyweight if they didn't have to weight cut, if we're being honest. But the guy was... Darko Stosic is a 6 foot, 230 pound. Like, he was not going to be in a position to beat a guy that is, 6'4", 260, like naturally competing at that 260 pound range. So, I see some people that are optimistic Gaziev is going to be able to want Buday. Buday's never been knocked out, and he's got underrated defense, and he's good at deploying the volume when the situation is appropriate for it. Gaziev's not going to be tremendously bigger than Buday is. And I actually have Buday as 6'3", and it's like in my notes, and he's apparently listed as 6'4". And there's no reach advantage really here. Gaziev's only got 1.5 inches reach. So I am a little concerned about if Gaziev's able to get that offensive wrestling going and Buday's takedown defense doesn't hold up. Buday does have 100% takedown defense through his UFC career so far. So if he is able to stuff those early takedowns and you see Gaziev start to get into those sloppy shooting attempts, I mean, maybe he's able to clinch on the fence in a way that Buday's able to or unable to get off. But the longer this fight goes, the more I see it in Buday's favor. He's got the better performance going the distance. He's got more experience and more success going the distance. And he's ultimately going to have more offensive volume. I think he's got more striking acumen here and experience than what Gaziev has previously faced. This is a big step up in competition for Gaziev. I don't think you can say this is the most difficult fight Buday has had in terms of just sheer overall MMA ability. In terms of matchup, it's probably the most intriguing because he hasn't fought a fighter that is going to be this adamant about offensive wrestling before. But there are other skill gaps and questions about Gaziev that we don't have about Buday that I think make him an even more confident play here than what his price is illustrating. I have a very, very strong grade on Buday here. It's one of my most confident of the card. I'm a little hesitant to make him a parlay leg for a third time in a row. But I've been calling him the king of the sloppy heavyweights all year, and that's only been proven to be more true. And as his price does go down, it's only going to kind of inspire me more to take the risk on him just because the value is going to be there in the parlay. So I call him at 150 and he's down to 135. I mean, I think he should be lined out to at least 200, if I'm being honest. So I very much have Buday graded to win here. I'll say that he gets it done by decision, but it wouldn't surprise me if, he maybe he gets Gaziev tired after several failed takedown attempts, and then Gaziev sloppily tries to come forward for another one, and while Buday is, stuffing it again, he's kind of able to just tilt him forward in a scramble with how strong he is in his own right. And while he gets on top, maybe he's able to, find another Kimura out of 3/4 mount. But or not 3/4 mount, but just he falls into 3/4 mount out of a takedown attempt or scramble and is able to use that to get to another position to set up. I'm going to talk about Bryce Mitchell later. He did a good job of falling into 3/4 mount and good positions in his takedowns against Dan Ige. But that's another fight for another time. Martin Buday is going to beat Shamil Gaziev, and I will probably make it a leg. And you'll think I'm crazy, but I believe in him. The next fight is Andre Fili against Lucas Almeida. I took Fili to beat Nathaniel Wood, and even though he didn't win, I felt very, very vindicated by that pick just because of the early knockdown that wasn't scored as such that Fili got, and I didn't really expect Fili to have that much power for Wood, to be honest, but then he ended up knocking down Wood again in the second round, and with that fight 1-1 going into the third, you love being on a value side the gate. I think Fili was plus 180, so Wood must have been close to like a 2-1 favorite, and with that discrepancy in the line. But Wood ended up getting the unanimous nod, took the third round, helped that he had the England crowd on his side, but kind of confirmed that he underperformed relative to his follow-up performance against Muhammad Naimov, although, he in that fight had the crowd working against him as opposed to in his favor. So it'd be interesting to see how he does in a more neutral setting against an established opponent. But it's weird coming out of that fight how people are, interpreting negatives relative to Fili's performance. I'm just kind of surprised because the price on him has come down a little bit relative to when I picked Fili to win this fight. And I understand the path to victory for Almeida, given Fili's chin's already been hurt at this stage of his career. And Almeida has really good offensive volume and combos and power to match that. And when you kind of have that overwhelming amount of finishing ability through strikes in your favor, you're going to be an intriguing play in most spots, which is why I picked Almeida to beat Sabatini, but he just did not show enough of a well-rounded skill set in that fight for you to feel good about him competing against a high-level, well-rounded talent, which is what Fili has shown he is over the course of now 20 UFC appearances. So I think that I'm surprised that the experience of Fili is being discounted so heavily here, given that he's only a year older than Almeida is, and Almeida's only had 3 fights in the UFC and is 1-2. I mean, lost his Contender Series appearance to Zellhuber, which is considered one of the best Contender Series fights ever, and then beat Michael Trezano, who's no longer in the UFC, and then got submitted by Pat Sabatini. Almeida's only gone the distance once in his entire career, and he lost that fight to Zellhuber. Fili this is a step up in competition for Almeida again. Fili's going to have a reach advantage. He's a little bit better defensively than Almeida is just because of how much volume Almeida throws that leaves him vulnerable to counters. But based on how you saw Sabatini dominate the offensive wrestling in their last fight that allowed Sabatini to set up an arm triangle submission, I mean, Fili does not put up a lot of submissions has not through his UFC career, so you have to imagine that Fili's looking at this and thinking, okay, I need to get the best of this guy for 15 minutes. The worry here is, even if Fili has a good first round, it's possible Almeida just comes out like a bat out of hell in the second, knowing that he's got to just empty the tank to try to get a finish, and Fili succumbing to that pressure. You don't have the certainty that Fili is going to be going after takedowns and putting this fight on the floor where it'll be safest for him for all 15 minutes. Even though he's a guy that averages at least 2 takedowns per 15 minutes for his UFC career and has been to plenty of decisions. 15 of them compared to 1 for Almeida. So I do think that Fili by decision here is it's a pretty clear path to victory for him if he chooses to take it. But it's going to come down to whether or not he chooses to go there or not. If he spends too much time on the feet in the early half of the fight with Almeida, it could be a very, very problematic ending for him. I want to be more confident in him. I thought I was going to end up having to lean on him as a leg when I was going through the early stages of grading this card, because I do go from the ground up just to kind of reward myself with evaluating the high-level fight at the end of the journey as opposed to burning that at the beginning. But there are more confident plays I have now, and I do think that Fili will win. But, it's possible I might do like a hedge parlay or something where, I swap him out as maybe Buday for a leg. And I've got two other more plays on this card relative to the range that these fighters are in right now that I'm more confident in. But we will get to those as they come. As for now, Andre Fili, I think, will win and get a solid victory for him against a fighter that hasn't quite established himself in the UFC yet. And I think this is just a little bit too big of a step up for him in competition right now. The next fight is Tagir Ulanbekov and Cody Durden. So the first pay-per-view that I ever graded with my analysis was UFC 272. And I'm going to be bringing that up more than a few times on this show because there's 4 men's fighters that competed on that card, including Colby Covington, that are competing on this card, UFC 296. As I alluded to, one of them is Covington. Another is Bryce Mitchell, who fought Edson Barboza that night. A fight that I think has been frequently overlooked in Mitchell's career, as well as Barboza's. But then you also have Brian Kelleher. Oh, so I'm actually wrong. There's 5 men's fighters on 296 also fought at 272. So Colby Covington, Bryce Mitchell, Brian Kelleher got tapped out by Umar Nurmagomedov. But then you also have Tagir Ulanbekov and Dustin Jacoby were also all competing at 272. Dustin Jacoby beat Mikhail Oleksiejczuk. Tagir Ulanbekov lost what I thought was a very controversial decision to Tim Elliott. And that was the beginning of my quest to find the ultimate fade on Elliott, which turned out to be the Makayev fight, was not the Sue Maderji fight from last week. But, plus money's plus money. Ulanbekov, I thought, was going to win that fight at 272, and you just saw a lot of the penalties and fouls that, stuff like fence grabbing and more glove grabbing in that fight was the issue. And Ulanbekov even complained about it to the referee, and Elliott admitted after the fight that he, had gotten away with some of his cheating. But if there had actually been a point appropriately deducted, that fight ends in likely a unanimous draw. Or if Elliott is not even grabbing the glove to begin with, it's possible he gets finished at the end of the third round when Ulanbekov, finally takes his back. So, credit to Tim Elliott. He powered through the follow-up performances after that event, and we really, aside from a quick choke of Nate Maness and Maness's UFC flyweight debut, haven't really gotten the chance to see much of Ulanbekov, and as a result, he's been out for over a year. Consequently, I don't see many advantages for him in this fight against Cody Durden, which leaves me very surprised given I've seen from the people that I trust, I've seen nearly unanimous support of Durden as an underdog this week, and yet his price has not fluctuated from plus 145. I find that very surprising. Durden is one of these guys that has shown evolution to his game in the UFC, and the fighters that you're always most encouraged by, I think, are not just the ones that are able to flesh out their game, but especially the ones that are able to add striking that blossoms. The wrestlers or the grapplers that come in and you just are thinking and wishing, oh, if they just had some hands in some way, like imagine what else they'd be able to set up with the threat of everything else that they've got. And you've seen Durden kind of become one of those fighters in follow-up appearances. I stayed off of, or I believe I picked Jake Hadley to win, or I might have stayed off that fight. I'm not sure, but I remember having a heavy amount of doubt about. I believe that I just barely graded Hadley to win, and so I put it out as a stayed away because he was something like a 2-1 favorite. But it was killing me to not pick Durden because he had done me very well against, I believe it was O'Day Osborne, in another fight where he was an underdog and ended up getting a 30-27 unanimous. So Durden has consistently shown, relentless ability to go after takedowns and secure dominant position when he gets it on the floor, and if not necessarily end the fight, at least, end rounds in, an optical way that end up to his benefit. One of the most famous examples of that is the fight he had with Chris Gutierrez, in which he came in on short notice. Gutierrez outclassed him on the feet for the first 10 minutes, but then Durden very early in the third round just came out, immediately shot a takedown, and Gutierrez, kind of doing the guard goblin routine he did against Song Yadong, wasn't able to get up, and Durden was able to earn a unanimous, or I don't know if it was unanimous, but he got a 10-8 round that turned the fight into a draw, in which he had moved up to bantamweight on short notice just to get into the UFC. So he is a guy that can wrestle or just fight flat out for all 15 minutes, even when he's lost the first 10. And I think, even if this fight ends up going to decision, I mean, we've seen Ulanbekov get burned by judges on American soil before, but I think as long as Durden is able to avoid submission attempts, there's enough striking that he has added and demonstrated. I mean, he did knock out JP Buys pretty coldly in another fight that I picked him in last year, and what was one of my first events I ever put out publicly for MMA Rax. Durden has just consistently shown an ability to perform as an underdog, and this is another really good spot where, given Ulanbekov has been out for over a year relative to the last time we saw Cody Durden, which I believe was only, it was just in August, so it was only a handful of months ago. I mean, you really, really have to like the ring rust advantage for Cody Durden here. And if he's able to take advantage of that, get his game plan going more quickly, this fight only gets further and further out of Ulanbekov's favor. Even though they have similar experience going the distance and Durden just has a little bit more success, you still have to like where this fight goes for Durden if it goes to decision on his terms relative to Ulanbekov. So I'm going to be taking Durden here. in light of the fact that Ian Garry's fight has been canceled, this is now one of only 2 underdogs I have on this card, but typically some of the best cards I've had have been ones where I only pick 1 or 2 dogs and then am mostly chalk on all my other picks. So we'll see if I'm rewarded for that thinking. I know many people have live dogs this weekend, but I think the one that most of the betting community has agreed on is that Durden should be the underdog here, or that Durden should win here. I believe he opened as the favorite and the line has since flipped, and I think that's just a reflection of the fact that the lines have been available for so long, and Ulanbekov is obviously a heralded name in Russia with having alignment with Khabib. You can very famously see Khabib's reaction to the Tim Elliott decision if you disagree with the result the judges gave out. But regardless, even if Ulanbekov does have an effective first 10 minutes, I think if Durden just shows a little bit more, he's a USA kind of guy where I think the American crowd is going to be behind him for this, and I would expect Durden to at least grind out a 29-28 here. So give me Cody Durden by decision. The next fight is Dustin Jacoby and Alonzo Menifield. So the Jimmy Crute Alonzo Menifield saga is finally behind us. Menifield has been a curious case for me as a capper. He was one of my legs last year on an event that I didn't unfortunately make any money on, but when he fought Misha Cirkunov, I was fairly confident based on the attrition Cirkunov had picked up that Menifield, when he did finally catch him, even though he was a guy that could be a little bit counter heavy, Menifield was eventually going to be able to put him out, and that ended up being the case. So I was happy to have that read. I thought a guy with a more well-rounded skill set like Crute was going to be able to bounce back from the attrition and time off and get the better of Menifield as he started to get up there in age. But I mean, he's a guy that has aged pretty gracefully, and it's reflected, somewhat in his last 2 performances. He did get the better of Crute, obviously, just because of the attrition that Crute had in the first fight, and then faded down the stretch in a way that I don't think is super encouraging for this fight. But I mean, you saw him, even though it was ruled to be a guillotine, I mean, it was a second UFC submission, and I believe his first one was a Von Flue or a Bravo choke, which is a much more rare technique than a guillotine or a rear naked choke. So he's a guy at this point that has demonstrated he's got solid submission ability, which is something that we tend to see fighters as they stick around in the UFC and age in their late 30s. That's one of the only things that they're typically able to improve is technique with submissions, more so with the submission defense than submission offense, which is an important point for a fight that we're going to talk about later on. But Alonzo Menifield here, I think, has shown that he is better than what this fight is currently lined at. And I'm surprised that there's so much optimism about Jacoby already back, given he was an underdog against Kennedy and Nchekwu. It's been a complete roller coaster betting this guy since he stepped in. He was a favorite against Oleg Sejuk at UFC 272, as I said. I was nervous about betting him just because there were some injury rumors, and he did end up confirming in his post-fight interview that he had some kind of leg injury that prevented him from kicking in that fight. I was a little bit, cautious about him, and after he admitted that, even though he picked up the unanimous decision, Faded him against Da Woon Jung. That ended up being disastrous, even though I got Jung at what was plus money, or picked him at plus money before the line ended up evening out to a pick him. Then I tried investing in him for Khalil Roundtree Jr., that fight a year ago. And I think I already talked about it earlier on with the Junyoung Park Muniz fight, but you could just tell, I mean, that it was not going the way that it should have on the scorecards. It was inexplicable. So I thought that he did get robbed there. He won I believe it was the first and second rounds, and then Roundtree Roundtree got one of the rounds unanimously. But the thing about that fight that I think is interesting relative to Jacoby fighting Menifield is Roundtree ended up winning that split just because of a few powerful shots that he got, that he didn't even get a knockdown on Jacoby. Jacoby was not wearing the damage as well as Roundtree was. And so I wonder how that's going to play into this fight if these guys have both been hurting each other, and we know both of these guys are hard hitters. Jacoby just knocked out in Chekwu, but we also saw Jacoby get dropped multiple times against Azamat Murzakanov in a fight where I had Murzakanov graded to win, but I just didn't have the confidence in him because of the layoff that he had, and decided to take the under, thinking that one of them was gonna be able to crack the other one. And Murzakanov did hurt Jacoby, but not in a way that ended up finishing the fight. And the other weird thing about that fight was Jacoby, when it was evident that he was going to need a finish to win, in the middle of the third round, inexplicably decided to start shooting takedowns, which was not something that he had really ever gone to in his UFC career, at least in this second run he's been on. I'm not privy to what he tried against, Clifford Starks and Chris Camozzi in 2012, but since his Contender Series appearance in 2020, I mean, he's tried to almost exclusively make everything a kickboxing match. And so you wonder how, if Menifield does decide to shoot a takedown at some point, or is even just able to get a hold of his neck in the same way that Menifield did against Jimmy Crute in the second fight, against someone who's a very credentialed grappler, what is he going to be able to do if he gets a knockdown on Jacoby and is suddenly in a position for a club and sub? It's very, very possible Menifield gets too locked into counter hunting in this fight, and Jacoby gets too far ahead on strikes in a way where it's evident that Jacoby's going to win a decision. But I don't see the finishing upside for Jacoby here that I do for Menifield relative to knockouts or to getting a submission. And for that reason, I'm stunned that the fight is lined the way that it is. So I have to take Menifield here at this price tag. Plus 230 is pretty outrageous. I'm going to be... The line is only getting wider too. So Menifield has actually blossomed out to plus 250 now. And I just think that that's wrong relative to where the finishing upside here is. The longer this fight goes, the less optimistic I feel about Menifield. But it is shocking, to say the least, to see that Jacoby's now a 300 favorite after he was an underdog against Nchekwu, a favorite against Murzakanov in a fight where he lost to Roundtree Jr. as a favorite, and was at one point the favorite over Da Woon Jung, but ended up closing in pick'em range, and ultimately did knock him out. But he's just been all over the place with his lines, and I'm looking at this here again, and I'm wondering if he's just too expensive right now for you to play him against a guy that has shown well-rounded finishing ability at the UFC level. Jacoby has not shown that. Jacoby doesn't have any submission wins in over 12 years. He won by triangle choke at Disorderly Conduct St. Paddy's Showdown in 2011. He hasn't won by submission since. He's lost by submission twice since. He could pick up a third one. It would be his second in the UFC after getting submitted by Chris Camozzi. And so I'm, and that was from a guillotine. So we just saw Menifield win by guillotine too. So we'll see what happens. But I think the value side for this fight definitely has to be Menifield. It's two powerful hitters and not necessarily the best chins. And we've seen Jacoby knocked down several times in recent fights. So, or not recent fights, but he did get knocked down. I don't know if they counted the first round knockdown in the Murzakanov fight, but he unquestionably got knocked down in the second round of that fight. So we know he can be cracked, and we know he's getting up there. And these guys are, both, they're both heading into their mid to late 30s, or they're both in their mid 30s, heading into their late 30s. But Menifield's got less wear and tear and an easier path to fighting, finding the chin, and also finding the neck for a submission. So give me Alonzo Menifield to win. I'll say he gets it done by submission. I'll say it's a club and sub. The next fight is Cody Garbrandt and Brian Kelleher. So I really wanted to believe in Garbrandt in this fight, but as I looked further and further into it, and as I watched the fight with Trevin Jones back, in which I made a very accurate read that I was very proud of in taking I believe it was 2-1 plus money on that fight going over 2.5 rounds. And I said, no, I think that it does go the distance because I would expect Garbrandt to fight a heavy-hitting, low-volume opponent like Trevin Jones in a way where Garbrandt doesn't want to get knocked out. And that was exactly what ended up happening. Garbrandt ended up losing the third round to a fighter that threw a combined 7 significant strikes in the first 10 minutes, or landed 7 significant strikes in the first 10 minutes. So it was, as much as people were, you heard Rogan hyping him during that. He's like, Garbrandt looks like a former world champion tonight. He looked good for the first 2 rounds, but he did finally get a little bit stung in the third and fought not to lose down the stretch in a way that taking him at 2-1 here, I wanted to believe that it was the right play just because you have to think Kelleher's fading and there is a bit of an age gap. But the thing is, you go back and look at when Kelleher was an underdog just 3 years ago fighting Hunter Azur, and he, in the second round of that fight, he didn't just get like a, we hurt him, and then they get into some scramble and he ends up on top and ends up, grounding and pounding him out. Kelleher knocked that dude that was way younger than him out cold. It was bad. And that was just 3 years ago that he did that. And it was his first knockout like that in something like 8 years. He hadn't knocked anyone out like that since like 2011, 2012. So you were still wondering if the power was still there at that point. But I mean, you even heard Rogan. I don't know what fight. It might have been the Garbrandt fight against Trevin Jones, but he was saying something about how like power's the last thing to go. I remember hearing him say it during my taping this week, but I can't. I think it might have been actually when he was fighting. I think it was the Masvidal Covington fight was actually when he said that. But if it really is the last thing to go, I mean, Kelleher's got a so much more well-rounded game that. The big thing where Kelleher's been beaten a lot is with submissions, and Garbrandt has a totally absent submission game. So this fight is going to strictly be striking, and you have a guy whose chin is borderline nuclear gone at this point, like just total wasteland, like don't even want to approach it, and got hurt against a low volume, high output, or low volume, high power striker in Trevin Jones at the end of the fight. But that was Trevin Jones. Kelleher is a very, very established, credentialed UFC veteran, even at 37 years of age and the ring rust that he has. If Kelleher's power from 3 years ago is still there in any capacity, how do you think Garbrandt's chin is going to respond to that? The edge and volume here is to Kelleher, both in terms of strikes landed per minute and accuracy in doing so. Cody's going to have to wrestle to get him tired. But the thing is, Kelleher's takedown defense is not even that bad, and it's at 60%, which is pretty average for the UFC. So Kelleher's probably not going to be able to mix it up here. Garbrandt is a little bit better defensively, but the thing is, you just, with the price that Garbrandt is at, he was 2-1 earlier this week and it's since come down. You still just can't feel good about it relative to the chin he has displayed and the question marks about whether or not Kelleher is still able to throw that heavily. We've seen plenty of old man vicious knockouts this year. Don't forget about what Matt Brown did to Court McGee. Like, UFC veterans that have power can crack even as they get older. It's still more about technique than anything else, as you'd be surprised. As I've gradually come to realize in watching and evaluating week over week myself. If Kelleher still has it, Garbrandt's going to feel it. And you'd be better off just watching this fight and appreciating it as a fan than putting any money on it. So I actually have Kelleher slightly graded to win, but because I don't know whether the power is going to be there or not, even though I have to acknowledge that it existed into the 30s, the, presumed beginning of the decline of Kelleher's career, if it isn't gone yet, it is a big risk for Garbrandt in a way where it might be worth an underdog play. But I have other underdogs on the card that I like that I don't feel tempted to chase this one. So I'm going to stay off. The next fight is Bryce Mitchell and Josh Emmett. I am very, very, very confident that Bryce Mitchell is going to take this pretty handily. I don't think that we're going to necessarily see an overnight drop-off from Emmett, and I don't think that there's been that. I think Topuria was not a good matchup for him, and I think Yair was similarly not a good matchup for him. But I brought it up on the show that I did about Topuria versus Emmett in that breakdown. Emmett still very much has the power that elevated him to being able to get a title shot, albeit an interim one. Yair Rodriguez said that he does not remember winning his interim championship. He claims he was basically fighting on autopilot because he got hit so hard by Emmett that he has trouble remembering what decisions he was actually making while he was still fighting. It's quite a claim. Not a super outrageous one, just given the weird way the brain works and everyone's unique brain chemistry. But Josh Emmett can still crack. The problem is he's fighting a guy that just showed 3 months ago he can get hurt and still grind out a 30-27 in the eyes of a judge. Now, Mitchell only got a 29-28, like, from 2 judges, but he did get 130-27 against Dan Ige. And Mitchell is a guy who has consistently shown, I'm going to put the fight on my terms if the avenue to do that is there. He just did it last year to Edson Barboza at UFC 272. It was a fight in which that fight was not expected to go the distance, and I was really surprised because I figured, if Mitchell is able to deploy his preferred fight against a high-level UFC veteran like this, then it would stand to reason that the fight is going to go over. And so that was one of the only good reads I had that night was, or at least relative to underdogs, was the Mitchell-Barboza plus 2.5. I also picked Greg Hardy to beat Sergey Spivak that night, so we've come a long way, folks. But anyway, Mitchell, he's just going to have too much of a relentless approach to getting his takedowns. I mean, he's not even 50% accurate on his shots, but he still averages over a takedown per round, which speaks to how relentless his approach is. And Emmett is a guy that I think this is a really key thing that I've seen not too many people pointing out this week. His takedown defense was already like average to below average going into the Topuria fight over his entire career. Fell 12% to 46% going into this fight, which is now considerably below average. Not even at 50%. Still better than Bryce Mitchell's, but Mitchell will welcome this fight going to the ground. But further than that, if you actually look at Emmett's history in the UFC, and you look at the fighters that he's competed against going back to around 2017, since his fight with Felipe Arantes, he fought Ricardo Llamas in December 16th of 2017. And between that fight with Llamas up to the fight with Yair Rodriguez, the only opponent he faced in that 9-stretch run that tried to take him down, not even took him down, just attempted to take him down, was Dan Ige 2 years ago. So Emmett's takedown defense is largely a product of what he showed earlier in his career when he joined the UFC in 2016 and his sophomore year in 2017. In the time since, this guy who is this team alpha male credentialed wrestler has not been tested in that capacity by anyone other than Dan Ige. Granted, in a fight that Emmett won by unanimous decision. But we just saw the 38-year-old Emmett, when tested by a wrestler, granted probably the best wrestler the featherweight division has right now in Ilia Topuria, you just have to wonder what is going to happen against another high-level ground specialist for a guy whose takedown defense is as bad as what Emmett just showed his is, and has been largely untested for the last 5 to 6 years of his career up until he fought Topuria. This is an excellent bounce-back spot for Bryce Mitchell. I think it's why he was eager to step in on short notice. He's also the opposite kind of skill set that Emmett had been preparing for in Giga Chikadze. Emmett's going to need a knockout here on a guy that's never been knocked out, on a guy that had his eyes shut in the last appearance he just fought 3 months ago, relative to the 6 months ago that Emmett competed. So you have to like the ring rust advantage there too for Bryce Mitchell. I heard someone else make the point this week that, Mitchell's always going to come forward looking for his takedowns because he's a guy that has shredded his nutsack with a drill at home And after you go through an experience like that, you don't really have the same level of fear. And even though there's kind of a joke there, I do think it's true. There's just kind of that, about that action farm boy mentality that Mitchell deploys to his UFC approach, but he doesn't do it in a way that's just relentless striking. He does it in a way that, we're going to get on the ground. If you're going to make the choice to grapple, I'm going to be better than you at that too. And it's just going to be a miserable experience for you, whether you want to try to survive or whether you let me get off my elbows and my hammer fists, or let me go hunt for a submission like a twister. So I don't know if we're going to see Emmett get submitted here. He had never been submitted prior to, kind of getting club and subbed against Yair Rodriguez. So I would say it's more realistic that Mitchell wins something like a 30-26 decision here, as he did against Edson Barboza last year. But Bryce, Rakhmonov notwithstanding, Bryce Mitchell's my most confident pick of the whole card. So I think that he is very appropriately priced in the 200 range. I'm going to be making him a leg this weekend. Not a good matchup, unfortunately, for Emmett, but I think even the UFC matchmakers probably see at this point, for a guy that is on the last two amount of attrition acquiring performances that Emmett is, his goose is probably cooked at this point. He might hang around as a ranked guy maybe into age 40, but in terms of him being a title contender, as we saw at the start of this year, that ship is probably very much likely sailed. The next fight is Paddy Pimblett and Tony Ferguson. Real quick, I picked Vincente Luque to beat Ian Garry, and it was announced overnight that Ian Garry, after missing yesterday's media day, would not fight this week due to what's being described as pneumonia, but I think given the overwhelming climate around fight week that has been swirling, it's kind of evident to see why Garry's pulling out here. It's tough. The guy doesn't feel like his family's safe. I mean, that's, even Luque talked about it in media day yesterday. He stands by what Garry is doing for the sake of, feeling like his family is safe and secure, and it's very classy. But it just makes me feel more confident that Luque was going to be able to pull off a huge upset. And it stinks that now the fight has fallen apart and Luque's off the card entirely. It'll be interesting to see who they bump up, but that was going to be a big underdog play, and one I was hoping to end the year on. And it's unfortunate we don't get to see it now. I'm looking forward to all the fights on the main card, but whatever they bump up to replace is obviously not going to have nearly the billing or the hype. So tragic that we lose that, but we still get Paddy's a Paddy and Fergalicious. I can't bet this. After what I have such bad history with both of these guys. I was so confident, taking Paddy after what he did to, was it Jordan, right? I hope I got the name correct. When he fought Jordan Levitt. I knew Levitt was kind of sneaky good, and Paddy still wasn't super proven enough that I said you're going to want to stay out of this if they get into some weird rolling stuff or whatever. And I don't know if Levitt won the first round of that fight, but Paddy did end up winning after I advocated for staying away, and it would have been a good chalky spot for me for my parlays if I had taken advantage of it. So I didn't want to pass on the next time that Pimblett was available, and I played him against Gordon. And I remember playing him against Gordon and thinking, even if this fight is close, they're still going to have to give it to Pimblett because the media rollout that they've had with Barstool this week is so ridiculous. They have too much invested in him to have him lose. And that's exactly what happened. That was the most vindicating moment for me last year relative to considering promo push for actually betting these fights. You have to factor in if they're going to have good grace with the judges, if you're going to make them a parlay leg or not. Because that's how you correct for, even if they end up having a bad performance, there's still the outside chance that things are going to split your way just because the company needs them to. That's why we haven't seen Paddy in a year. I don't think it has anything to do with injuries as much as it is we can't have you get in another. There's too much invested in you from a brand standpoint, both for the company and for yourself as a fighter, to have a potential catastrophic hiccup like that again. So they needed to wait, and they needed Paddy to improve his skills because he was a guy just coming into his prime at 27 years old a year ago. And, fate brings forth a fighter that should probably have been cut already 2 fights ago, but is still hanging around on a 6-fight losing streak in Tony Ferguson, one fan favorite. And so the UFC is very much hopefully looking at this as a passing of the torch moment. But we have seen the MMA gods laugh at the UFC for trying to force the issue before. We saw it at Tony Ferguson when he was expected to fight last year against Li Jingliang, I believe. And due to the carousel of events that happened with Khamzat Chimaev, they ended up rebooking Ferguson against Nate Diaz in a fight where Ferguson was winning for stretches, but then inexplicably made the decision to shoot a takedown, which he's not comfortable with, and he very promptly got guillotined by Nate Diaz. So I remember taking the over 4.5 rounds in that fight and feeling very good about it relative to all the stalling Nate was doing until Ferguson inexplicably did that at the advice of his corner, which was really not good. There's too many different directions this fight can go if Paddy has another letdown performance to make me feel good about taking him as 300 favorite here. If he were closer to 200, I would be really having to consider it just because of the age gap. There's obviously things to like here for Paddy that he didn't have against Gordon a year ago, but Ferguson's going to have a reach advantage. He's going to have an offensive volume advantage. He's got better takedown defense. He did drop Bobby Green briefly in his last fight and then got poked in the eye, and then the fight got away from him. But the longer this fight goes, the less I'll feel good about Ferguson. But there's just too much potential, I think, in the early stages for something weird to happen where Ferguson just barely ends up edging it out. If it goes to decision, I would expect even another screw job again in favor of Paddy that just kind of pisses people off even more. But Ferguson has been, famously training with Ryan Goggins, I think his name is, and a lot focus on endurance and not giving in. So I think Ferguson is really trying to make this go 15 minutes. Which, might be to his detriment. But listen, if he's able to get the first 2 rounds on Paddy, could get weird. Just could get weird. So we'll see what happens. We'll see if Paddy's made improvements in the last year. But I just can't bet this after having a weird history of betting both these guys. I was tempted to take the over, but the last time I took a Tony Ferguson over 1.5, it was when he fought Michael Chandler. And I was sitting in the stadium live for that. I remember exactly how that went. So sometimes the best play is no play. The next fight is Shavkat Rakhmonov and Stephen the Wonder Boy Thompson. What a stupid line. I mean, I'm not sure what it opened at, but you hate to see Rakhmonov. I mean, you wonder if he's ever going to be at a playable price again. I remember, like, when he fought, I believe it must have been at UFC 271, because that was the last, like, time that I just kind of blindly did a YOLO parlay, and I remember looking at Rakhmonov and thinking, like, oh, this. I had watched. He was one of the few guys at that point that I had on that card that I had watched compete before that wasn't in the title fight, which was Ngannou Cyril Gane, I believe, and I was thinking, I can't believe that this guy's available at this price for how obvious it is he's going to win this. He was fighting, I think, Carlston Harris, knocked him out with a head kick, and I was just like, man, I look forward to betting this guy more in the future, but it just, there's never been a price to do it at since. Hopefully they give him someone that is, kind of the well-rounded level that he is. But at this point, I think the cat's out of the bag on who the guy really is, just in terms of elite ability. But the weird thing is, I mean, Wonder Boy, I think, put on the best performance we've seen from a 39-year-old a year ago against Kevin Holland. And people can say, I mean, I'm one of those people that bet Kevin Holland that doesn't immediately point to, oh, he would have won if he had actually grappled and not let him up. It's possible, but at the same time, Holland was enough of a wild ass going in even before that he did that it's possible that he made some other stupid mistake or would have at some other point in the fight that ended up costing him the win. His hand was already compromised at that point. So it certainly would have been in his best interest to fight. But what happens in that fight if Holland never ends up breaking his hand after how badly he hurt Thompson in the first round? So that was still one of the best fights of last year. And I think that Thompson surprised a lot of people with how competitive he was and then ended up winning. And I expect him to surprise a lot of people with his competitiveness in this fight too, even with the age gap and the other tools available at Rakhmonov's disposal. I still expect Thompson to put up a greater degree of resistance than people are anticipating, just because he is a fighter that has very seldom been finished and has never been submitted. So as I alluded to earlier, fighters, as they get older, one of the only things that they can really improve is their submission ability just through refinement of technique, and that much more applies to defense than offense even. So as he's gotten into age 40, you only expect that his submission defense has become more refined, and he's very, very prideful of being a high-level MMA competitor that has never been submitted and wants to hold on to that into the point where it's finally time for him to retire. So even though you would like to think that Rakhmonov is going to get the finish by submission, I think that his actual best path to finding a finish is to get a TKO on the ground after hurting Thompson on the feet. The thing is, people are wondering if it is in Rakhmonov's best interest to even allow extended stretches on the feet relative to the striking ability Thompson has, or if Rakhmonov should just mix it up right away with wrestling and then trying to transition to taking the back and then looking for a submission. So I think Rakhmonov, it's going to take more time. He hasn't fought since the Jeff Neal fight earlier this year. So he's been off for quite a long amount of time himself as well as Thompson. I think that leads to a more conservative opening round between the two of them, and that makes me really like the first, the +1.5, just because most of the fights, when a finish does happen, they tend to happen in the first round. And if you're taking away if you're theoretically taking away the potential for a submission based on the fact that Thompson's not going to submit Rakhmonov, but Thompson's also never been submitted himself, then you're basically looking at is one of them going to knock out the other? And Thompson's a guy who has gone over into the second half of fights in 11 straight appearances, has only been knocked out in the UFC by Anthony Pettis, and that fight was in the second half or it was past 7.5 minutes rather. So I think the plus 1.5 is a good play here at minus 170. There's always the potential that Thompson just gets caught by, something crazy that Rakhmonov has, because he does have the one-punch lights-out power, and he does have phenomenal kicking game, just an all-around really high-level MMA practitioner at 29 years old. I want to believe that this goes over and that Thompson finds a way to at least make this a split, but I do think that Rakhmonov is ultimately going to find a late stoppage here. I just think that Thompson is able to give him more resistance up front, where people that are maybe wishfully thinking for a first-round stoppage from Rakhmonov, given his minus 650 money line price, are going to be left a little bit disappointed. So give me the plus 1.5 here, and give me Rakhmonov to hopefully get a title shot after this. He deserves it, and I think he's probably the best welterweight alive right now. The co-main event at UFC 296 is a flyweight men's title fight between Alexandre Pantoja and Brandon Royval. I saw Royval at UFC 274, and so I remember that Matt Schnell almost finished him in the first round. Royval, just because he's, he calls himself the raw dog. He is a wild dog in terms of the way that he fights, and he even said in the press run this week that he was going to fight at a quote unquote suicide pace in this event. Now, that's an interesting proposition, given Royval has never gone 5 rounds, has gone 5 rounds less often than Pantoja has, and Pantoja has also, even though he's a bit inconsistent late into fights himself, is at least a better late round performer than Royval is, and has more 5-round experience based on his latest victory over Brandon Moreno. Now he's looking for back-to-back wins over Brandon's, although he's already beaten Brandon Royval once. I think we get a bit more of a measured approach from Pantoja here, given the experience he picked up in the last fight. For that reason, it's possible that he drops the first. But Pantoja is a fighter that's never been finished and has added enough to his skill set and shown, really phenomenal grappling ability, which was the key to his win over Moreno, were his lightning quick back takes that allowed him to rack up control time for large amounts of stretches early on in rounds. Royval, I think, is going to have a more difficult time getting out of those positions, which is one of the reasons why he was submitted when they fought the first time. So if Pantoja is able to weather an early storm, there's going to be multiple avenues to victory for him as Royval starts to get tired and is fighting at what he calls himself a suicide pace. So even he looks at this as, I've got to finish this guy here because it's my only path forward, and I'm just going to be coming forward and throwing, and, whatever happens, happens. If I die, I die. That's what the suicide pace is. Pantoja is much more measured than that, and I think that his status as champion is going to reflect that, and I won't say that he goes 5 rounds with Royval. I'll say that he gets a 3rd-round submission this time as opposed to a second. I think both of these fighters have improved since the last time that they competed, but Pantoja just has too many different advantages here that I'll feel good about betting him even if he goes out past 200. He's thankfully, for my purposes, held at 190 like all week, but I think that he's going to have an easier time finding Royval's chin and has the power to potentially earn a knockout if Royval is leaving himself exposed to counters. He's the more accurate and higher volume striker is Pantoja, despite the fact that Royval's going to be fighting at this suicide pace. He lands takedowns at twice the frequency over 15 minutes that Royval does, despite Royval deploying them with greater accuracy. He's got better takedown defense than Royval does, so in the event that these guys do try to mix up the fight against each other, I expect Pantoja to be more successful in doing that on his terms. Royval, for the suicide pace that he's acclaimed to fight at, does not even have as many UFC finishes as Pantoja does. Pantoja obviously has less attrition on the basis that he's never been finished in his MMA career. He has more than 2 times as many fights going the distance that Royval does, and he has greater than nearly 20% more success in the final rounds relative to what we've seen from Brandon Royval. There's so many strong reasons to like Pantoja in this spot that I am a little bit surprised it isn't lined wider, and I've heard a lot of other people express similar optimism or a similar outlook this week. I give big credit to Marcus Williams of the Nubian Bookstore because he asked me very early on what I thought about that Pantoja-Moreno fight as he was preparing to make a big play on it. And I kind of teased out my pick a little bit just because I never actually grade these fights until the week of. But I eventually let him know that I was slightly leaning Moreno. He was still very confident in his pick of Pantoja. Flew out to Vegas for UFC, I believe that was 291, and watched Pantoja Moreno and cashed a huge play in person, hearing the champ get their name read by split decision. Must have been a gut-wrenching moment, but a huge win and exhilarating. And then Pantoja gave one of the most, powerful championship victory speeches in an octagon I think we've heard in the UFC in terms of that call out to his dad. So an easy guy to root for is Pantoja. I'll be backing him here. Him and Mitchell, I think, make a very, very nice little 2-leg parlay by themselves. But like I said, I'm going to be trying to work in, some kind of leg, whether it's one of the overs I'm taking or possibly Andre Fili or Martin Buday. We'll see how the weigh-ins go and if any of these fights end up encountering any other hiccups, but I do feel very good about this one. Pantoja to retain, get his second victory over Brandon Royval, and hopefully we see a bit more diversity in the matchups for the title fights at flyweight going forward. And now we come to the main event. A men's welterweight title bout between Leon Edwards and Colby Covington. Very conflicted about this one. I didn't do, it's interesting because I said the first event that I graded the first pay-per-view that I graded was UFC 272. And so in my database of fighters, in terms of the ones that I've taken their stats, Covington is number 20 out of like the 600 that I've compiled to this point. So he, and because of his fight with Masvidal, showed up very early on in the data set, but I didn't really tape him to a super great extent just because I got a very early read early on that, I think that the play for Masvidal Covington, because the line was wide, is just going to be to take the over. And that ended up being correct, even though I ended up going out much earlier in the night due to other incorrect reads that I put into parlay legs. But subsequently, I didn't really tape Covington that much, and because he's been out for as long as he has, I didn't really get the opportunity to do so until this week. And so I watched his second fight with Kamaru Usman, and I watched the fight with Jorge Masvidal, and there were a few things that I think I was a little bit surprised about. He showed a greater potential for chaining combos together than I previously anticipated. I think that the most shots I saw him throw in distance in succession was like 4. And, even though his head protection is, below average, teetering on bad, his footwork was still there. And, I mean, the threat of the constant takedown shots, I guess, presents enough of a puzzle for opponents that he's going to have his striking available to him, even though it is a little bit underdeveloped. He fouls more often than I anticipated. That was a point of contention in 2 different ways in his fight with Masvidal, and where he not only received warnings or was told that he committed an eye poke that Herb Dean missed, and then between rounds Herb Dean tried to say, hey, you did poke him, so keep your fingers up, and Colby tried to play like, no, I didn't, and Herb was like, dude, I watched the replay, like you did it, like you're guilty, and Colby looked like a 8-year-old kid that got caught, like, with a hand in a cookie jar or something, after Herb was like, bro, I saw the replay, don't try that bullshit with me. And then later on in the fight, Colby illegally kneed Masvidal in the groin, and Herb, no nonsense, was like, that was an illegal knee. I'm taking the position away. I'm not going to take a point. But he did outright take the position away and break them up without really. It was kind of a weird thing because the broadcast didn't really acknowledge the foul on Masvidal as much as it was one of those illegal knees where the focus is less on the fact that the guy got kneed and now is taking time to recover, and more on the fact that it was blatantly illegal and is the guy going to take a point or not. And Herb didn't end up doing it, but it's just something interesting to keep in mind is that Colby, who seemed disappointed with himself after he lost position in, I believe it was, he looked disappointed with himself after he lost position in the Masvidal fight because of the illegal knee. So he is a guy that will, put himself in a bit of a dirty position to his detriment. And that is something to just consider relative to fight IQ, particularly against a fighter like Leon Edwards, who lost a point in his last fight for a fence grab in a fight that's going to be reffed by Herb Dean, who was officiating the last 2 fights for each of these fighters. So Herb has a history of catching these guys committing fouls, and you have to take that into account for how that might come into effect in this fight. What I think is really going to be the key difference here is just the ring rust. It's been consistently a factor in title fights that go beyond this one. The most obvious example I can think of this year is Cejudo versus Sterling, in which there was a very much a big discrepancy in the ring rust between how recently Aljamain had competed versus Cejudo being off for something I think like 15 months. It was one of the longest layoffs that a challenger has had going into a title fight in UFC history, and Cejudo conceded in his post-fight interview that it affected him early on in the fight. He had trouble getting going in a way that wasn't as difficult later on into the fight that ultimately yielded a split decision in that result. I think that you're going to see something similar here, particularly because Colby was a bit of a slow starter in his fight, his title fight with Kamaru Usman. Really in both of them with Kamaru Usman, but I think even more so in his second fight. And it did, it was kind of he really did have a bit of a snoozer against Masvidal. I mean, he was able to get the fight how he wanted on his terms pretty early on, but that fight was really largely up to wrestling, and Masvidal at that point had kind of been over the hill and wasn't going to have the takedown defense to keep up with that. Whereas with Edwards, we've seen his ability to recover even against guys like Usman. And Usman was still able to have rounds where he was able to largely win with the wrestling and, keeping Edwards from being able to get out of his grasp. But there's enough diversity in the high level of Edwards' game that you think that a guy that has competed at least a little bit more recently, particularly in a title fight than Covington has, that guy will have an easier time getting his game plan going early than the one that's had a layoff of almost 2 years. This is the longest layoff that a challenger has ever had going into a title fight, what Covington is about to try to win with. I don't think you can underdog, and it's enough of a reason to stay away. I do have Edwards graded just slightly to win here, but there's an interesting point that Usman made on media rounds this week in discussing this fight, because Usman is a guy that has faced each of these opponents in title fights before. So he's got a very unique perspective. And what he said about Colby is not the kind of guy who, after not encountering success with his takedown attempts, is going to relent and strictly focus on striking, so that he can, ideally channel his cardio fully into that as opposed to further exhausting himself with unsuccessful wrestling. Colby has enough of a gas tank that he'll just keep deploying the takedowns even if he goes 0 for 11. He's not going to stop shooting. He's just going to keep going and keep going. And that was one of the reasons why Usman was able to dominate the first fight with Leon Edwards, short of getting head kicked on a Hail Mary in the final minute. The relentless approach has shown that it can eventually break Edwards in a way where it's too difficult for him to get out of that grasp and start winning the rounds. It may take Covington time to get going, but if he is able to at least get going by round 3, I think we could see a scenario in which Edwards wins the first 2 rounds, but Covington is able to come on and win the final 3, or at least put it in an ambiguous enough situation where going into the final round, or perhaps over the course of the final round, it's not entirely sure which way it's going to go because both fighters have at least banked 2 rounds at that point, evidently. I think this is going to be a very close fight, and I do slightly lean Edwards. But the combination of gas tank and relentless nature that Covington obviously possesses makes me wonder that if by the time that he gets over the ring rust through the first 10 minutes, is he going to be in a position to put Leon Edwards in his worst position to retain his title? These guys, I think, have gone the distance in something like 25 out of 30 of their UFC events. It's really interesting to me that Edwards continues to not have as much juice put on his overs, given how infrequently he's been able to finish fights, and further than that, just how miraculous his finishes have been, or how late into fights that they have come. So I think the over is an extremely good play here. I have to think about taking it more strongly than the likes of an Andre Fili or Martin Buday money line, but I really, really do think this fight is going to end up going the distance. At that point, you should take your hands out of the money of the judges, and you'll be able to appreciate that fight for 5 rounds for what it is. It's going to be very, very difficult for Dana White to pass up the spectacle of Donald Trump wrapping the belt around the waist of Colby Covington in the final UFC event of the year, in which Sean Strickland upset Israel Adesanya. if this fight is close going to the cards, even if it feels like Edwards should win, I could see Colby getting a greasy split. I don't think this is an optimal environment for Edwards to be fighting in, even though I slightly lean towards him winning. And so I think the much safer play is to just take the over and live with it from there. So give me the plus 5.5, or 4.5 rather. Give me Edwards to win by decision, but I won't be surprised if Colby Covington has a Make America Great Again hat on, as he is finally captured the belt that he has for so long pursued. And that's going to conclude the MMA RAXPOD for 2023. I can't believe that the show had the success that it did from the time that I started. It hasn't quite grown the way that I've wanted. Let me remind you again to please like, share, and subscribe. But it is difficult to get on here and do this by yourself. So I give credit to people like Best Fight Picks, Dan, who are able to churn these out weekly. It might be a little bit easier, if I did have a partner in crime, but for whatever reason that hasn't materialized yet. Perhaps someone will recognize my ability next year and ask to get me on a weekly correspondence with them in some form. But for now, I'm happy with where things are at. Not going to end the year with anything less than a 33% ROI. So we have that to look forward to, but obviously want to end the year on a high note, and I think we can do that. The potential's certainly here with this card. I'm looking forward to it very much, and I want to thank you for tuning in to the MMA RAXPOD this year. As I said at the top of the show, probably only going to be doing these in a pay-per-view capacity moving forward, but I got big plans for this platform, and as it continues to grow, we'll see how things change and who gets involved. It's going to be time for me to start writing soon, though. So if you guys want to see threads, I haven't done those in any capacity yet, but I've seen those have more popularity than I at least anticipated. I really wanted to get my own content platform up that I could publish on, but if just going directly to the source is going to be better, I really could start writing at length about these fights and just posting them into long-form threads on Twitter as opposed to just putting the pics out. So if you've listened all the way to the end here and you have an opinion about that, let me know what you think. But either way, I'm grateful that you tuned in. Let's end the year on a high note, and happy holidays to you and your families, folks. Thank you. Take care, and have a nice weekend.